Even watching the film as an adult, it's hard to deny the captivating power of Walt Disney's first feature-length film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The film is a technical marvel, the first feature-length cell animation that utilised both colour and sound, and it was the film upon which Disney built his empire. But why was Walt able to do what so many people thought was impossible? And what is it that makes Snow White so timeless? This is the story of Walt's first masterpiece. Hello and welcome to 100 Years of Cinema. We'll be taking a look at least one film each year from 1915 onwards to track the evolution of film over the last century. When it premiered on December 21st, 1937, it blew audiences away, with 1.5 million individual drawings which were sketched, transferred to transparent cells, then coloured and composited into 350,000 frames that ran for over an hour and 20 minutes. With this, Walt changed the game when it came to animation. The film's worldwide gross totaled $6.5 million by 1939. Even today, it's still the highest performing animated film ever made. It earned Walt an Academy Award and secured him the funding to go on and build the greatest animation empire the world had ever seen. So what made Snow White so successful? It wasn't the first feature-length animation committed to film. Filmmakers had been creating feature-length cartoons since at least 1917, with the earliest surviving from 1926. Nor was it the first colour cartoon or the first with synchronized sound.
The ball and join in, everybody.
But it was a huge leap in the quality, technology, and story capabilities of animation. This is a cartoon from 1935, and this is Snow White just 2 years later. According to legend, the idea to create Snow White dates back 18 years before production started, when a 15-year-old Walt Disney saw a silent version of Snow White in 1916.
It's a thing I remembered as a kid. I saw Marguerite Clark in it in Kansas City one time when I was a newsboy. They had a big showing for all the newsboys, and I went and saw Snow White. It's probably one of my first big feature pictures I'd ever seen.
The idea had been developing and growing until one night in 1934, Walt gathered his animators and recited for them an early version of the story that would eventually become Snow White, along with the characters and their personalities. The purpose of this meeting was to do more than just unveil a new idea for a story. It was to inspire the animators to see what was possible through the medium of animation, that they could do something that had never been done before. They could create a feature-length animation that carried the same pathos and dramatic weight as a live-action film. Snow White was so far ahead of the other cartoons at the time that over the 3-year production, many critics doubted that the film was even technically possible. The film was referred to as Disney's Folly, and its initial budget of $250,000 eventually ballooned to almost $1.5 million. And even if it was technically possible to create the film, people doubted that the audience could sit through more than an hour's worth of cartoons without getting headaches or becoming bored. But what Walt realised was that in order to keep the audience engaged, they would need an emotional connection to the film that early cartoons were unable to produce. The emotional gap between the audience and the cartoon characters needed to be bridged, and in order to do this, Walt needed to imbue Snow White with a sense of realism, giving the audience the feeling that this was all happening to a real person who could think and feel, allowing them to empathise with Snow White and the dwarfs, all while retaining the charm and whimsy that comes from the unreal nature of animation. Almost every choice made in the production of the film was pointed towards striking this balance, from the writing and direction, to the character animations and designs, to the music and Foley effects.
To age my voice, an old hag's cackle.
All designed to carefully tread the line between the realistic and the fantastic. You can see this pull towards realism in the evolution of the characters' designs. When the film first started development in 1934, the characters were very similar to what you might see in a Silly Symphonies cartoon. But as production moved forward, Disney artists settled on a much more naturalistic representation of Snow White, one that emphasized her innocence and purity, but at the same time resembled a real human being, playing down the caricature style that was common in early cartoons. This push towards realism went beyond just the characters' designs. Walt hired actors to create live-action sequences from the films, and the footage was either directly rotoscoped or used as reference to guide the animators. During production, Walt had his animators attend life drawing classes to better develop the skills of capturing movement, and the result was incredibly lifelike animation. Compare the Merry Dwarfs from Disney Studios in 1929 to the dwarves in Snow White. Their movement has personality that gives you insight into their characters. It carries weight and it feels natural. And because of this, you can see the dwarves as individuals, almost alive. You can empathize with them as they pull you through the story. You feel their surprise at finding Snow White in their bed, their love for her innocence, their fear for her safety,
The Queen! Snow White! The Queen will kill her!
their heartbreak at her death, and finally joy at her happily ever after. The same is true when you see Snow White running with panic through the woods. You can feel the fear by looking at her movement alone, unlike fear depicted in some earlier cartoons. This naturalistic movement wouldn't be quite as effective if it wasn't taking place in a real feeling world. Compare the animals, trees and environments from earlier silly symphonies to those in Snow White. Locations such as the castle or the dwarf's cottage was designed to be a reflection of early European fairy tale illustration, exaggerated and whimsical, but at the same time not so unreal that you couldn't picture yourself there. To build on this feeling of being in a real world, Walt had his technicians devise ways of mimicking film techniques and camera movements that were common in live-action films. Once again, this served to further eliminate the barrier between the cartoon and the real world. To do this, engineers at the Disney Company created an entirely new way to photograph animation: the multiplane camera. Principally, it operated the same way as traditional animation. Individual cells were stacked, photographed, and then moved slightly to produce the illusion of movement. But it had one key difference. Instead of cells being laid flat on top of each other, each one was suspended individually, allowing animators to control the depth, speed, and movement of up to 7 individual layers. Disney first experimented with the multiplane camera in the Silly Symphonies cartoon, The Old Mill. It was used very simply, and it gave the animation an almost 3D quality. Snow White, however, pushed the limit of what the multiplane was capable of. By moving layers in different directions, animators created the illusion of a whirling vortex for the Queen's transformation. This new depth, made possible by the multiplane camera, also allowed for a new leap in the direction of cartoons. For the first time, animators could realistically simulate camera movement and the placement of camera as if it was truly located within the world of Snow White. Instead of the flat, front-facing perspective of cartoons, the viewer could now move through the trees. It could take on the perspective of an animal looking up from the ground, or of Snow White as she gazes down at her own reflection in the bottom of a well. All of this goes to solidify the physicality of the world of Snow White and further give you the impression that the events happening have real-world consequences. Once Walt had nailed down the reality of the characters and the world, the final step was to make the film sound like a real place. It's no surprise that Walt focused his attention on sound. After all, he did create one of the world's first synchronized sound cartoons in 1928 with Steamboat Willie. But it was sound effect pioneer Jimmy MacDonald who really brought the sounds of Snow White to life. Jimmy had joined Disney in 1934 and cut his teeth creating sound effects for early Mickey Mouse cartoons. And where he used sound to punctuate a joke in his early cartoons, in Snow White he used them to create an immersive environment, building on the physicality of objects in the world.
You know, you need an empty wallet, and I had no trouble with that. I had lots of these. But they'd walk like this.
This added element of lifelike sound is the final ingredient in creating the illusion of a real world. And when you add all these together, you get an almost perfect vehicle for exploring characters' emotional depth. You're drawn in by the charms of this Germanic fantasy world, but at every turn, you're confronted with panic, joy, optimism, jealousy, and every other emotion. Here's how Variety described it a week after the film's premiere. So perfect is the illusion, so tender the romance and the fantasy, so emotional are certain portions when the acting of the characters strikes a depth comparable to the sincerity of human players that the film approaches real greatness. Of all the innovations that Disney has brought animation, this is the one that changed everything. The emotional response to these stories is why the audience can sit down for over an hour and become completely absorbed in a magical world. Because no matter how fantastic, how beautiful, and how out of this world a cartoon, Disney grounded it to the same reality that affects you and me. So if you felt emotionally affected by Up, The Brave Little Toaster, or Toy Story 3, you can thank Walt for animation that reflects the real world and for giving us the cartoons that we can connect to.
Hey, thanks for watching 100 Years of Cinema. My name's Charlie. I want to say a massive thank you to all the people that support me on Patreon, particularly my latest supporter, Gary Lee. This has been the first time I've watched the animated Disney film since I was a child, and back then my favourite was always Robin Hood. But rewatching this time, I think that might be on par with Sleeping Beauty. But what do you think? What's the #1 animated Disney film? A lot of the books about the making of Snow White are prohibitively expensive, so while they are included in the links below, I want to do a big shout out to Snow White's people. Not only are they much cheaper, they're a collection of one-on-one interviews with the animators and technicians that made the film, and it's a really great first-hand account of the making of Snow White. I've put together a playlist of some of the best video essays about Disney and other animation, and you can find that by clicking here. Watch the last video over here, you can subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon, as well as gain access to a load of bonus videos by clicking over here. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.
It's apple pies that make the men folks' mouths water. Pies made from apples like these.